In this lesson, we're going to talk about some absolutely critical concepts to keep in mind when it comes to working with your RealFlow scenes and their overall scale and size. Okay, so for this example, I already have a very simple scene file set up. If you'd like to open this up and work along with me, this is found in lesson 06, Start. And really what I have is, again, just something very simple, a couple of vase primitives. These can be created just from our primitive menu. And these are at pretty close to their default scale and size, so really not a whole lot of resizing that's happened here. I also have just this simple little circle emitter that is going to be able to emit some particles into this cup, so that way they can sort of spill down. And then I also have just a quick gravity and a volume in here as well to make sure none of our particles escape out into this open area. Okay, so with that set up, let's go ahead and I'll press the A key on my keyboard and just let this simulate. And you can see we have these particles that are spilling into our cup and sort of falling down. Now, when it comes to working within RealFlow, the overall scale and the sizing of our objects is extremely, extremely important because, as you know, when it comes to things like fluid or liquid behavior, obviously a little glass of water is going to slosh and flop around a lot less than something like a huge barrel of water. All right, they're going to look very, very different as far as their overall behavior. So within RealFlow, we have to know the overall size of our objects, because otherwise, how do we know if we're simulating something that's going to behave like a little glass of water or something that's going to behave like a big barrel of water? So RealFlow actually has some tools built into it that will help us determine that. So if I were to press Control A on my keyboard, again, just very quickly reset my simulation. If I had something like this little vase or this little glass selected, what we can do is go up to our Measure tool. So if I click on my little Measure utility, this will actually give us the volume and the size of this object. So you can see, looking at the volume, this is going to be a little over 2,300 liters. If I were to switch this to an American unit, that's the equivalent of a little over 628 gallons. Okay, so this is not just a very simple glass of water. This is a massive container of liquid. So again, really, really important things to keep in mind. So whenever it comes to looking at RealFlow's distancing units, each one of these little grid units is the equivalent of 1 meter in length. Now, if you consider that as far as human proportions, if you think of typically a very exceptionally tall person is going to be around 2 meters in height. So that gives you an idea that a human being standing up would fit in this area. So with that in mind, this is, again, a very, very large container of water. So if I were to take this object and, let's say, try to scale that down, let's say something like 0.2, 0.2, and 0.2, now you can see we have this really, really tiny little object. And again, with that selected, if I go back to my Measure utility, a little less than 10 liters now. And again, looking at my American units, that's a little over 2.5 gallons. So getting a little bit better, but still pretty large, considering that this is supposed to be a glass of water. So we can continue to scale this down, but the problem is that when we start to get into these very, very tiny scale objects, RealFlow actually has a problem when it comes to simulating something that's this small. And really, again, I'd have to go even smaller than this if this were going to be something like a glass of water. So if I were to set my scale way down, maybe something like 0.2, so that's a little over a liter, a little less than half a gallon. So that's getting a little bit better. But again, in order to get the proper amount of detail, we're going to have a tremendously small collection of particles here. And you also notice that whenever we start to get scaled down this small, sometimes RealFlow's navigation can really start to get kind of crazy on us. So you can see as I'm trying to move around, it's just that we're trying to move in such a small space that it just becomes almost impossible to work. Okay, so with this in mind, bringing our objects down this small is really not going to be a proper solution. So what's the alternative? Well, let's take a quick look at that. Now, let's try to remember that we had to actually scale this glass down to about 1/10 of its original size in order to get it in the right proportions or the right size that we needed it. So we'll keep that in mind. So we'll set that to 1 by 1 by 1. And I'll maybe just take this and scale it up just a little bit more, just so that it's a little bit deeper. Now, instead of trying to scale my objects way, way, way down, what we could actually do is tell RealFlow to basically have these demons, things like gravity, actually have a stronger influence. Right now, this gravity is set to something like 9.8, which is actually the proper units for gravity. So Earth gravity is about 9.8 meters per second squared. So with that in mind, if this were actually a real size, this is pulling the water down at a rate that we would see typically if we were going to see this water coming off the side of a building or off of a roof. But for something that's going to be traveling a very, very small distance, a few inches, this is going to start to look very, very slow. And we can see that if I were to simulate this, and we'll just give this a second to simulate out. Okay, and then once that's done, we can see our particle behavior. Now, if we actually wanted to see what this looks like in real time, we could go up to our playback and use our video preview. So with the video preview enabled, we can come in here and let this basically start to cache up. And once this is finished up, we'll be able to see what this actually looks like in real time. So we can make sure that our timing, our movement, things like that are actually proper. So again, this would look good if this were water traveling over a very, very large distance. But for something like a glass of water, this is obviously moving much, much too slow. So again, what we can do is actually tell RealFlow to essentially have the demons and gravity start to pull things down with a much greater strength and try to simulate something that is maybe a little bit more on the lines of what we would get with a smaller scale object. So I'll go ahead and press Control A on my keyboard to reset my simulation. Now let's come in and take a look at our simulation options. Now this can be found inside the Simulate. Now there's a little pop-up that will come up, and this is all the way down at the bottom. We have our simulation options. Now it's being cut off on your screen, but it's again at the very, very bottom of that list here. So in here we have our simulation sub-steps. Now we'll actually come back and talk about this in a second. This is actually not the area that I was wanting to get into. Instead, let's go over here into our scale options. We'll come back to our simulation options here in just a moment. So let's go into our scale options. Now this is where we can start to set things like our geometry scale, our demon forces. So for example, if we were to take our geometry scale and set that to something like 0.1 and hit enter, you can see that our objects became very, very tiny. This is essentially the exact same thing that we were doing by setting the actual scale on our objects. Now again, this really doesn't help us out because RealFlow is going to try to simulate this very, very tiny container. And again, RealFlow can start to experience some instability and other issues trying to simulate things that are that small. So this is, again, probably not the best solution for us. Let's instead go back to our scale options. I'll set the geometry scale to 1. What I really want to focus on is this option right here, our demon force scale for particle fluids. Now, again, remember we had to set our geometry scale to about 0.1, or about 1/10 of its size, in order to get the proper scaling. So with that in mind, let's make sure our geometry scale is set to 1, and let's instead take our demon forces and increase that by a factor of 10. So let's hit OK. And now, if I were to come in here and again press the A key on my keyboard to resimulate. Okay, so once I have a few frames of this simulated, we'll go ahead and I'll just press the A key on my keyboard to stop my simulation. I still have a few frames to go here, so just to make sure that it's only these 150 frames that get put back into my video player, I'll just go ahead and set my timeline to 150 frames and 150 frames, so that way it's the entire timeline here. Now let's go ahead and go back to our video preview. Let's let this cache through and let these frames build up so we can actually see what this looks like in real time. And once this is finished, now you can see that the water is pouring down much, much faster, okay? You can see that our water is now behaving a lot more like something that we would see in a smaller little container of water. Things moving much faster, building up much faster. Now we do have a few issues here that we do need to resolve. So if I were to come in and play through, you can see that there are a few frames where some of these particles are actually spilling out. So we can still come in and fix that. That should be pretty easy to resolve. What we see here is just a situation where some of these particles have actually essentially just come out the backside. Now, looking at this, this might actually be a situation where maybe this emitter is actually, just a little bit on top of my cup here. So press Control A to reset my simulation. I'll go ahead and switch to my Move tool, which is the W key on my keyboard, and just make sure that that emitter is tucked completely inside that glass. Now this also brings up a really important concept called substeps. So as we start to experience particle movement where from one frame to the next, by increasing that particle demon strength by a factor of 10, we've now set up a situation where from one frame to the next, our particles can go through actually a tremendous amount of movement. Now, when we start to get movement that is that dramatic from one frame to the next, sometimes RealFlow can have some problems with the accuracy of that movement. Now, in order to fix that and increase that accuracy, we do that by increasing the substeps. Now, this is where we actually get into the Simulate menu. So once again, we'll pull down this little arrow, and this time we'll go to the options, and this is actually what we need to get to. So we have by default an adaptive substep method. So RealFlow from one frame to the next or from one simulation to the next will sort of automatically decide how much accuracy it needs. Now, again, this may not always be the best solution, especially when we get dramatic particle movement. So let's try increasing our minimum substeps from 1 up to maybe something like 100. So that way it'll start to use, as its lowest point, a much higher accuracy level. So press OK. Again, Control A to reset my simulation, and A to let the simulation go off again. Now, by increasing the substeps, keep in mind that that will increase our simulation time. So that's kind of the trade-off that we have here. So now we should have a little bit more accurate particle behavior. Now, we overall need to get a much higher number of particles in here to begin with. You can see right now we're only at about 3,000 particles, which for getting realistic fluid simulations is going to be typically way too low. So once again, press Control A on my keyboard. Maybe come in and make this emitter a little bit smaller so that way it's not emitting quite such a broad stream of particles. But in order to get more particles in here, now let's take our resolution and start to bump this up. So we'll start with something like resolution of 10. Again, press Control A. Again, keep in mind that increasing this resolution will dramatically increase our simulation time. So let's come back in here. Maybe also take that emitter, move that a little bit further back. So that way our particles have a little bit more time to actually sort of coalesce in here. Okay, so after we've let this simulate for a little while, go ahead and press the A key on my keyboard to stop my simulation. And now if I were to come in and play this through, it gets to be actually fairly difficult to see through this glass. So what we could always do is take this and maybe either hide it or switch it to a bounding box, whichever works best for you. Now we can actually see that fluid inside there. And again, because our gravity is acting now much more strongly, this liquid moving over what appears to be now just a few inches is now not going to splash and flare up like it would be if this were water that's falling down several feet or several meters. Obviously that's going to cause a much bigger splash. So overall our fluid behavior now is much more realistic and much more on the line of what we'd expect from something of this size. Now, as a matter of personal preference, just something additional that I like to do is come in here and add something like a surface tension, or rather a drag force to this. This can be found sort of up here just above the surface tension. So this is our drag force. The drag force can sort of act like air resistance. So without any sort of a drag force, we're essentially just simulating this in a vacuum. That's really not the way things work in the real world. We actually have air resistance and pressure, and this drag force will help us to kind of introduce a little bit more of that in here. Right now this drag strength is set to 0.1, but remember, because we have actually taken our demon forces and increased those by a factor of 10, that means that this drag strength is actually 10 times the value that we currently have typed in here. So let's also come in, and just for my final simulation, I'm going to take my resolution and maybe bump that up to something between 30 and 40, so I'll kind of go in the middle, start with 35 here. And again, Control A to reset my simulation, and now A to simulate again. Okay, and then once this gets to a certain point, about halfway through my timeline, what I'll do is go ahead and just take this circle emitter And for now, I'll just take its speed and set that down to 0. So at this point, my water should pretty much stop flowing. Now, here in one of our later lessons, I'll teach you how you can actually start to keyframe and animate some of these different values. But for now, I'll just go ahead and stop my animation, set my speed, and then continue my animation or my simulation from this point forward. Okay, then once we have that simulated, we can actually take a look at what this is going to look like back within our video preview. So just to make this a little bit easier to see, I'm going to take things like my drag force, my gravity, and even my volume, and I'll just make all of those invisible. So now let's come back and go to our video preview. All right, we'll let that play through so we can see our fluid starting to fill up. And you can see now this is the point where I've turned my emitter off. And you can see now as we play that through that we have this filling up that looks a little bit more like a real body of water. Now, if you look down here toward the end, you can start to see where my particles and my fluids start to jump up a little bit more. They start to become a little bit more boiling. This is typically something that happens if, again, my substeps are maybe not high enough. There's, again, still quite a bit of particle movement that's happening in this very, very close proximity from one frame to the next. So with a lower substep or a below normal substep, you can start to get some flickering and some jumping, which seems to be what is happening here. Now, really one thing that I want you to keep in mind, with this whole lesson we've talked about the importance of scene scale and getting this properly set up, but really here's the thing that I want you to keep in mind, and that's the fact that RealFlow is really not a 100% accurate fluid simulation system. This is really more you could think of as a fluid approximation. It's really just approximating the movement of these fluids. So with that in mind, it really is not all about having things 100% physically accurate. It is definitely very, very important, but keep in mind that, even with some of these settings set in every way what should be physically correct, even though these are set in that way, they may not give you the artistic look that you want. So if you want something that has, this smaller little glass of water, but you want to be able to get these really nice crowns and splashes, but the only way to do that is to simulate something that is more the size of a big barrel of water, that's perfectly fine, just as long as it gives you the artistic look that you want. So that's really what I want you to keep in mind, that while scene scale is very, very important, it's really can be thought of as just a faster way of getting the look that you want. Whether that be the look of a small little container of water or the look of a big, huge swimming pool full of water. Okay, so that's a look at how we can start to come in here and use some of these settings like our geometry scale, our demon force multiplier, to get this type of a look, and also how we can start to use things like these substeps to make sure that we get accurate simulation results at the expense of a little bit more simulation time.